We got hitched at 20, both of us. Around a year later, I decided to do the school thing again, to finish up my degree. Then we became parents, and I started feeling the heat to wrap up that degree of mine. My kiddo just hit 2 years old when I kicked off my final year of college. 2 semesters were all I needed to nail it, so in September of '93, my routine looked like this. I did a part-time gig from 3 in the morning till 7, stocking shelves at a store. Then a full-time gig, desk job at the police department, from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. Tuesday nights were school nights, from 5:30 p.m. to 10, and I had school again on Saturdays, starting at 8 a.m. and ending by 2 p.m. Now my wife did the nurse's aide thing at the local hospital, clocking in from 8 a.m. to 3 p.m. Our little one was taken care of by my mom. The cool thing was, everything, school, our jobs, and even my parents, was all super close by. I'm talking no more than 10 minutes to get from one to the other. We had a darn good setup going on, making things work as best we could for what I was aiming to achieve. Right before D-Day, the weekend was a non-stop battle between us. It was spring of '94, finals week for me. If I could wrap up my papers and ace my finals by the upcoming Sunday, we'd be cheering for me finishing up my bachelor's in science and finally getting out of this intense 8-month grind. However, she was mad because I wouldn't take a break from studying to take her and our kids somewhere. She'd been griping about my work and school for a while now, and it had gotten so bad that we hadn't been intimate for 2 months. On this specific Monday evening, I was double-checking a research paper I'd finished on Saturday, due on Tuesday evening, while she kept picking fights non-stop. Finally, I told her to shut up and quit acting childish. She stared at me and just blurted out, "I hate you and I'm in love with someone else." Bam! Just like that. I was floored. We argued for about an hour until she spilled the beans about what went down earlier that day during her lunch break at work. Apparently, for the past 2 months, she'd been caught up in an emotional thing with a janitor at the hospital. Well, it all started with him giving her compliments and just being around whenever she turned her head. Then things went up a notch to them having lunch together in the cafeteria, and after that, they began having regular sessions of bad-mouthing me to him. About 2 weeks ago, they took these complaint sessions to the car. She later admitted that during that time, they kissed twice. But today, things escalated to a full-on makeout session. It ended with her giving him a hand job while he was doing some stuff with his fingers, and they both went on about how much they loved each other. When she spilled this to me, I practically disconnected from reality. I mean, it's like I left this world for a moment. Later, I'll delve into more details about what was going on in my head that night. But for now, let me share what my wife wrote about that exact moment. It was weird. When I told him about what we did, I was kind of ready for some sort of explosion. But he just looked at me with the most awful pain you can imagine. Then it turned into something I can't even put into words. It was like he went blank. He turned away and walked into the bedroom, quietly shutting the door. I remember getting furious then. The jerk wouldn't even put up a fight for me? Right at that moment, I just felt like I'd made the right call and everything was going to somehow fall into place. I did it. I was finally breaking away from the guy who'd been ignoring me all these months. I walked back into the living room with a suitcase, walked past her, and headed straight out the front door. I recall her asking over and over, "Where the hell do you think you're going?" "Running back to Mommy's?" was one of the things she threw at me. I set the suitcase down in the driveway, went back inside, grabbed her purse and held it out, telling her to leave. That caught her off guard. She refused. So I lifted her gently onto my shoulder, carried her out the door, and set her on the car hood. Her surprise gave me the chance to dart back inside and lock the door. She tried to get in, but I held onto the deadbolt, and eventually, she left to crash at her parents' place. She let them know we were separating but didn't say why. That was a hell of a night. I rang up both jobs to explain a family emergency had popped up, and I wouldn't be making it in the next day. At some point, I drifted off to sleep. Update. I woke up at 7 and right away started figuring out how to cut down on contact with my soon-to-be ex, STBX. I rang up my mom to ask her if she could look after my son. She was concerned since he'd usually be there by that time. Then I jotted down a list of things I needed to get done that day, and I got cracking on the list. First, I dropped off my son and let my mom know I'd have to sit down and have a good talk with her later. After that, I swung by the office of a lawyer friend of the family. He'd known my dad from way back, and I'd known him forever. I explained that I wanted to kick off the divorce process pronto. He heard me out and suggested I take some time to mull things over, but I was dead set. He said he could have the divorce papers done by the end of the day. I told him I'd come by to pick them up and then personally file them at the clerk's office. Handling stuff like this was kind of my gig at work with the PD. Next, I went and got new locks for the house and made a pit stop at the bank. I cleared out and closed both our savings and checking accounts. I took half the money, put it in an envelope, and swung by my sister-in-law's workplace. I handed her my wife's share of the cash. I told her to pass on the message to my wife. No contact with me whatsoever. And that money was her half from the bank. I also let her know I had gone ahead and canceled our only credit card. Back at my mom's place, I spilled everything to her. She and my younger sister cooked up a plan. My sis would hang at my house and take care of my son while I juggled work and school for the rest of the week. I headed home and swapped out the locks, spent the afternoon cleaning up and goofing around with my son, then headed off to school. Meanwhile, my wife decided to skip work that day. She got in touch with the janitor and laid out what had gone down. He was understanding and invited her over to his place that evening to escape the stress. I'll give you more scoop on this place in a bit. Long story short, she went over and hooked up with him. Here's what she wrote about that night. He passed out afterward. I recall being all hyped up at first, but during and after, it started to feel off. With him asleep, my mind started wandering. I thought about G, that's me, and how he had kind of pushed me into this. Made me go find someone else. I got up and left. On the drive home, memories of the first time G and I had sex came flooding back. We were each other's first. I totally lost it and just kept thinking about how disgusted I was with myself. Then I circled back to being mad at G all over again. It was like this twisted cycle. I just couldn't face up to how horribly messed up what I'd done was. I convinced myself it was his fault. Update. The day kicked off just like any other. I headed to work, then got back home, took a shower, and had breakfast with my son and sister. My wife gave me a ring, wanting to sort out plans to see our son. She had this arrogant and spiteful tone on the phone. I let her know I'd meet up on Sunday at 1 p.m., and she could hang with him at a nearby park. But she wasn't having it. She was gunning for a weekend with him. I shut that down. She realized that having him stay at the house solved the whole babysitting issue. Both her folks were working, so she didn't push it further. She slammed the phone down. Off to work at the PD I went, and at my earliest chance, I swung by the clerk's office and got the divorce paperwork filed. Later in the day, a gal I knew there gave me a heads up that they were ready to head to the sheriff's office to get served. I called up a deputy I was familiar with and laid out the story, asking him to serve the papers to her while she was on the job. He agreed and said he'd do it the next day. Meanwhile, the STBX got back to work. Her janitor buddy swung by her spot and chatted her up throughout the day. Lunch wasn't doable that day, nor could they meet up in the evening. He claimed he had some commitment with one of his kids. He'd told my wife earlier on in the affair that he was divorced and had 3 kids. After work, she headed to her parents' place. Later that night, she called me 3 times, and each time I hung up the moment I realized it was her. Caller ID wasn't all that common in those days around where I was. Update. Following another night of heavy grieving, my day kicked off just like the previous one. I headed to work. As I got to my second job, I got a call from the deputy who was set to serve the papers. He mentioned he'd be there around noon. I said that was fine. Her lunch break was scheduled from 11 a.m. to noon. I sat at my desk making an attempt to focus on work. I was restless, getting up and heading to the bathroom about 3 times before I eventually threw up. I had to talk myself down and constantly remind myself that I was doing the right thing. Luckily, my wife hadn't reached out to me so far. 11 a.m. My wife meets up with the janitor for lunch. They slip away to his car in the parking lot and engage in intimate activity. Real classy. They clean up, return inside, and grab some food from the cafeteria for lunch. Noon. My wife heads back to the nurse station on her hall, accompanied by the janitor. They strike up a conversation with the RN in charge of the hall. 5 minutes later, the deputy walks in. He inquires with the RN about Kay, my wife. Kay speaks up, saying, "That's me." The deputy turns to her, and in a loud voice declares, "Mrs. Kay, you're being sued for divorce due to infidelity." My wife collapses onto the floor. Here's how she described the moment. When I heard that, this huge wave of shame and guilt hit me. It sunk in that I had wrecked my marriage, that G was actually going to divorce me. Part of me foolishly truly believed he wouldn't go through with it. I thought this was just another argument where I was trying to come out on top. It was some messed up thinking. Can recall the deputy physically lifting me and making me sit in the chair. There was screaming. It was coming from me. A, the RN, was trying to calm me down. T, the janitor, reached for my hand and I ended up punching him. He turned his head and my punch landed on his neck. I scratched him as he pulled away. A said I was shouting at him, going on about how he had ruined my life. Eventually, they managed to calm me down. The deputy mentioned that the janitor took off right away. She got herself together and went back to her shift, but A did a lot to cover for her. At 2:45 p.m., my wife was nearing the end of her shift when she got summoned to the hospital administrator's office. Fear gripped her. She figured someone must have reported her meltdown. When she walked in, the lady shut the door and wasted no time in telling her she was fired. She was instructed not to come back on the premise and that her final paycheck would be sent by mail. It turned out that someone had witnessed the rendezvous in the parking lot. They reported it. At some point, A had been brought in and shared the story about the divorce papers. The janitor had been called in for questioning, fired, and booted from the premises just an hour before my wife got fired. Word had spread throughout the hospital. She mentioned she just got into her car and drove over to her parents. At this stage, her folks still had no clue what was going on, just that she and I had split up, and things seemed pretty darn serious. At 5:30 p.m., I was having dinner with my son at home. My sister had gone out with her pals, so it was just us hanging out. The deputy had passed along the events from earlier, and I gotta say, it felt pretty satisfying knowing the impact. The fact that the janitor happened to be there was just sheer luck. I was surprised my wife hadn't been arrested for laying hands on him, but well, you can't have everything. Then a knock came at the door. In front of me stood a lady who couldn't have been more than 5 feet tall, and she was incredibly pregnant. She could barely stand up straight. She asked for Kay. I explained that she no longer lived here and wasn't coming back. She asked if I was her husband. I replied, soon-to-be ex-husband. I'd served her the divorce papers earlier that day. She introduced herself as Dee, the janitor's wife, and revealed she was carrying their 4th child. I invited her in to take a seat. She went on to explain what had gone down earlier, about her husband and my wife getting the boot and the whole messy situation. I felt like I might throw up. Who on earth was this crazy woman I had married? She also filled me in on the house where my wife had been meeting him. At that moment, if I could have found him, I would have killed him without a second thought. Not for my wife, but for the sake of humanity in general. This guy was a total piece of garbage. I'll tell you more about the house later. She asked me where my wife was, and I told her she was with her parents. After she assured me that she only wanted to talk to her and reveal the truth, I gave her directions. My son was still at the table in his chair, visible from where we were sitting in the living room. She praised me for being a great dad, handling the care of my son on my own. Then she got up and left. At 6:30 p.m., my father-in-law answered the door and Dee asked to talk to my wife. Thinking she was one of Kay's friends, he went and got Kay, who stepped out onto the porch to chat. Dee introduced herself and let Kay know she just wanted her to understand the truth about her situation with the janitor. Turns out Dee and the janitor were still married and living together. Dee was in the 8th month of pregnancy, expecting their 4th child. Kay was already upset, tears flowing, and she kept apologizing again and again. But things were about to get worse. You see, the janitor and another guy at the hospital, along with one of their buddies, were involved in a twisted game. Their goal was to see how many married women they could sleep with in just 90 days. Before my wife, the 3rd guy was in the lead with 3 conquests. My wife became the janitor's 3rd. Oh, and the night he supposedly had something going on with one of his kids, he was actually with a 4th woman. Dee revealed that this lady he was with had been married for 25 years, and Dee was planning to inform her husband next. It turned out she was their neighbor. Now, about the house. It was a place they rented out to rendezvous with these women. Dee found out about this just 2 hours after he got fired. He came home, high and crying, and spilled everything, hoping to work things out. Dee left with the kids, telling my wife she was leaving him. Then she squared up her shoulders, slapped my wife hard across the face, and called her a dumb cow. Kay was in shock. Dee told her she ought to be ashamed of herself for throwing away her family. She told her how she had been at our place an hour ago, watching a loving man feed his son all alone because his wife was a stupid, selfish witch. My wife completely lost control and started crying, while Dee walked away, got into the car, and drove off. My in-laws checked on her once they heard the car pull away. She was pretty much in a daze. They brought her inside and were debating whether they should take her to the ER when she started talking erratically. My father-in-law thought she might be on some sort of stimulant. She began rambling about how awful she was and how she needed to fix things. They eventually managed to calm her down and got the full story. My father-in-law was deeply hurt. He's always been a good man, and he mentioned later that my wife could see the shame and disappointment on his face. As for my mother-in-law, well, she followed her usual pattern and pointed the finger at me. I can't say I'm a fan of her. Right then and there. Aftermath. The day after, my father-in-law reached out to me and said he was sorry. It was the only time I ever sensed there might be tears in his eyes. He filled me in on what had happened, explaining that Kay had been holed up in her room day and night. I mentioned the Sunday appointment I had arranged with Kay to meet at the park at 1. He agreed and hung up. I worked on Friday and attended school on Saturday. By day's end, I got the news that I had passed and would be receiving my degree. It was a mix of emotions, but I had made it. My parents threw a celebration that night, with extended family coming over for a barbecue. I'm fortunate to have a wonderful family. No one brought up Kay. The following day, I didn't hear from Kay at 1 as planned. I took it as a stroke of luck, something I could use if there was a custody hearing down the line. At 3:30, her father called. He let me know that Kay still wasn't responding coherently, just wandering around in her bathrobe with a notebook in her hands that she wouldn't let go of. She hadn't bathed in days and was barely eating. He was worried and exhausted. He even feared going to sleep in case she harmed herself. He asked me to come see her. I turned him down. I couldn't muster any feelings for her. I told him to get her professional help and that I would consider letting her see our son once she got herself back together. Honestly, I felt nothing for her. That initial night had tested me, and I emerged stronger. I'll explain more later. I wasn't going to invest any care into her ever again. I didn't hear from her or her family for the next 2 weeks. Reconciliation. A couple of weeks had passed since my last conversation with my father-in-law. During that time, I quit my part-time job and was actively hunting for a new one. My MBA plans were on hold as I aimed to settle into a new job first. My son had been asking about his mother, and all I could do was reassure him. The longer she took to reach out to see him, the better it could be for my chances of securing a favorable custody arrangement. I was at the PD, police department, when she called, asking to schedule a time to meet and see our son. I inquired if she had managed to compose herself enough not to frighten him, and she replied affirmatively. I arranged to meet her at 9 a.m. in the park on Saturday and requested that she bring her dad along. I didn't want to meet her alone, so my mother accompanied me. Upon seeing her, I felt confident that my decision to limit her contact to just 2 hours was the right one. She was in a bad state, noticeably thinner, no makeup, and smelling of ivory soap. None of those familiar feminine scents I associated with her. Later, I found out that her mother had bathed and dressed her. Kay wasn't fully functional yet. Our park meetings continued for about 3 weeks, and I eventually extended them to 4 hours, including Sundays. Her appearance improved each week, but I remained concerned about her mental well-being. Therefore, I refused to let our son stay overnight with her or see him alone. Eventually, my mother-in-law grew tired of this arrangement and decided to hire a lawyer to file for custody. Now, Kay hadn't signed the divorce papers yet, and I was all right with that. After 6 months, I could file for divorce through the court anyway. But the custody lawsuit infuriated me because she was aiming for full custody. I had already discussed with her father that I was open to eventually working toward a 50-50 custody split, but her mother threw that out the window. In response, I counteracted with a request for full custody based on her mental state. Honestly, I was itching for a confrontation. I was furious and needed a way to release that pent-up anger. This was the opportunity. On the day of the custody hearing, my lawyer informed me that her attorney had approached him with a request. Kay wanted to talk to me privately. I initially refused. He mentioned it might be an offer, so I relented, but insisted it should be in the hallway outside the courtroom, where both attorneys could witness it but not hear the conversation. They agreed. She began with small talk, asking about our son and how he was doing. I replied he was great and improving daily. She asked about my schooling, and I informed her I passed and would be graduating next week. She seemed pleased with that. Then she looked down and inquired if she could attend my graduation. I responded that my graduation was meant for my family and friends, and since she was neither, the answer was no. That hit her hard. Throughout most of our relationship, we had worked together diligently to achieve that goal. By saying no, I conveyed that she couldn't share in that accomplishment with me. She pleaded, but I held my ground and repeated my refusal. I added, "It's special to me. It didn't matter enough to you when you let someone treat you like garbage." I was truly turning into quite an asshole, fueled by the desire to hurt her. She welled up with tears, turned around, and walked back to her lawyer. The hearing got underway. I testified, nothing out of the ordinary. Then my mother-in-law stood up and blamed me for everything. She claimed I was seeing someone and driving my wife insane. No evidence of that, but truth was never her concern. She also alleged that I had assaulted my wife by grabbing and throwing her onto the car hood the night she left. Next was my wife's turn. Kay started responding to her attorney's questions but stopped after the third one. She asked the judge if she could speak up. He suggested she confer with her attorney first, but she declined. He granted her permission. Here's what my wife wrote in her notebook. I remember feeling so sad as the hearing started. I listened to G presenting his side of the story and how he'd taken care of J, our son, all these weeks. I needed to make things right. Sitting there, I knew my mom was lying to shield me, but it was just one more lie on top of another. I'd had enough. I had to fix this. Kay then stated that she wanted to apologize to my parents, who were in the room. She also expressed remorse to her own parents. Looking at me, she acknowledged that I probably hated her more than anyone else right now. She admitted that everything that happened was her fault and that, at this point, she just wanted to salvage whatever was left of our shared history. Even if it was just to reach a point where I could look at her without disgust. Then she turned to the judge and expressed her desire to retract her claim, stating that she would accept any custody arrangement I deemed appropriate. I conferred with my attorney, and we proposed supervised 1-hour visits for 6 weeks, followed by weekends with him every other week, provided there were no issues. We adjourned. In hindsight, I think that's when I glimpsed a tiny hint of potential for us to be more civil to each other. Not a reconciliation, but at least a sense of mutual respect. The schedule worked well. By the 3rd week, our visitation time expanded to 3 or 4 hours, just the 3 of us, her, me, and our son. Although I wasn't exactly friendly, I relished observing my son enjoy his time with his mom. It was beneficial for them both. However, during the 5th visit, there was a negative incident. She unexpectedly hugged my right arm from behind while I was watching our son play. I panicked and yelled at her never to touch me again. She hugged our son and left in a hurry. The next week, we acted as if nothing happened, and she maintained her distance. Another month went by and we started discussing day-to-day matters more frequently. I'd landed a new job with better pay, and she had begun nursing school. She started confiding in me that the janitor was persistently calling her and wouldn't leave her alone. She claimed she wanted to be honest with me in case I heard something. Apparently, she had asked him to stop bothering her, yet he still turned up at her parents' house one evening. Her father-in-law even threatened to harm him if he didn't back off. I told her I no longer cared who she was involved with. She insisted she wasn't sleeping with anyone and wouldn't until she was sure our family could never be repaired. I bluntly stated that it was never going to happen. 6 months after our separation, I brought up the matter of her signing the divorce papers. She refused. I reminded her that I didn't necessarily need her signature, but it would be easier if she complied. She proposed coming over to the house that night to discuss it. She offered to sign the papers that night if I still wanted a divorce. I agreed. When she arrived, she had these notebooks, those little black composition books that look like bound volumes. She told me she had begun jotting down thoughts the day after she received the divorce papers. She didn't exactly know why, but it seemed to provide some sort of solace. She told me she wrote down every single thing she could recall about what had occurred, delving into as much detail as she could muster. She wanted me to read it, but cautioned that it would hurt deeply. In those writings, she detailed her interactions with the janitor, what she said and did. I wasn't eager to go through it. She acknowledged the risk she was taking, but she felt the need to help me understand why she was so determined to salvage our marriage. Reluctantly, I read it. She was right. It was tough. The physical aspect wasn't explicitly described, but the way she discussed me and our marriage in front of him, that cut to the bone. The account I read that night also chronicled her emotional breakdown. The writing was chaotic and disordered. Yet, each day it improved bit by bit. Eventually, she started dissecting her actions and words, using it as her own form of therapy. One amusing part was when she recounted a bizarre notion she had, believing it would miraculously set things right. You see, she remembered she hadn't orgasmed with the guy, not even once. In her mind, if she didn't climax, then it meant she didn't derive any pleasure from it. Therefore, she had done nothing wrong, and I should take her back. She clung to that idea until she shared it with her dad, much to his discomfort, and he pointed out that it didn't work that way. Although reading her account didn't alter my decision, it did alarm me. I still had concerns about her mental state. Only after reading what she had written during those 2 weeks did I fully grasp the fragility of her mind. I agreed to give it more time, partly out of apprehension. This newfound courage in her led her to urge me to write to her. Sit down, put together a letter or something detailing what had occurred. She believed it would give her insights into how to support me better. I considered this proposal. I recognized I was still in a messed up state, but maybe it could aid me in moving forward and perhaps maintaining some form of a healthy relationship later on. What she called her writing therapy gradually transformed into our method. We committed to meeting twice a week. Our initial task was to jot down our perceptions of our marriage's state before D-Day. During our meetings, we'd exchange our letters and take notes. Then we'd put our queries in writing and pose them to each other. We'd converse until each question was thoroughly addressed before moving on to the next. If we didn't complete everything, we'd continue during the next session. The guidelines were simple: be truthful, no yelling, and no avoiding any questions. Our journey began with assessing our pre-D-Day relationship, and we progressed through each subsequent day until the Sunday I conversed with her father after she received the divorce papers. Beyond that, we planned to reassess and proceed accordingly. I have to admit, I acted quite terribly throughout this process. I provided honest answers to questions except for one. More on that later. However, I used it as an opportunity to embarrass her. I made her repeatedly recount hurtful things she had said to him about me. I pushed her to share explicit details about the physical encounters. She hesitated at times, but she ultimately followed through. Although it was comparatively mild compared to what we once shared, it stung. Truthfully, I believed I could handle it because I genuinely wasn't interested in rekindling the relationship. Yet, hearing it was painful. It's astonishing how unkind I had grown, though in my mind it felt justified back then. About a month into this process, I had to admit it was somewhat beneficial for me. She suggested the idea of moving back in and trying the next phase. I declined. She pleaded and presented a compelling case, but I stood firm. Even if I considered reconciliation, I couldn't imagine being intimate with her again. She understood and even proposed that I could seek outside companionship while she remained faithful. That's not something I would be comfortable with, so I declined. Another month passed and I finally relented, but I established firm, non-negotiable rules for the path ahead. First, she had to sleep in the spare room. Second, absolutely no physical contact whatsoever. Third, she kept her money in her checking account, but I handled her banking and provided her with checks for bills, rent for the room, expenses, and some spending money. This was because she had given the janitor $300 from our savings account a week before D-Day. Also, I thought she might say no and not move in. Fourth, her mother wasn't allowed into my home unless we decided to reconcile. I was still mad at her. Still am a bit. Fifth, all previous custody agreements would automatically resume if we didn't reconcile. Sixth, if I started seeing someone else, she had a week to find another place to stay. She agreed and moved back in. It was tougher than I anticipated. There was no longer that cooling off period between the times I saw her. She was there all the time. I picked fights over small things constantly and said hurtful things to her. I wanted her out almost as soon as she moved back in. I needed a solution, so we started having what we called Thursday night fight night. This came from our meetings where we were writing things down. Every Thursday night after our child was asleep, we'd sit in the living room and discuss ongoing issues or arguments. They had to be resolved on Thursday night before going to bed and couldn't be carried forward. We actually still have a version of this today. It evolved into simply asking during dinner if there's anything we need to discuss that night. The kids never knew where it originated or what it was. I was still being difficult. I threw her affair in her face at every opportunity. She handled it calmly and never engaged when it escalated to that point. I'd say I was emotionally abusive towards her. However, she was strong. She believed we were meant to be together, and that since she had wrecked our lives, she had to rebuild it on her own until I saw things her way and joined her. She was dedicated to giving me the time I needed. 6 months after she moved back in, I had my own breakthrough. After a particularly rough day with constant triggers, I locked myself in the bedroom. I just couldn't handle it anymore. My wife came to the door and knocked, quietly saying, "You need to talk. I'll be out here whenever you're ready." I heard her slide down the door, sit on the floor and lean against it. She stayed there for an hour. It was nearly midnight when I finally opened the door. She asked if she could come in and I said no, suggesting we go to her room. We sat, she on the bed, me in a chair, and I finally opened up about what happened after I asked her to leave on the night I learned about the affair. Let's rewind to the evening of D-Day. After she drove away, I spent a lot of time in my son's room, just watching him sleep. I went to my desk, grabbed the checkbook and bill ledger, and took them, along with a copy of the life insurance policy, placing them in plain view on the kitchen table. I took a shower and then entered the bedroom, retrieving my piece from the closet shelf and placing it on the bed. I dressed in jeans, a button-down shirt, and even tucked in my shirt tail. I combed my hair and sat on the bed, holding the barrel of the piece in my mouth. I tasted the oil on it, which I had strangely fixated on. It tasted exactly as it smelled. I have no idea how long I sat there. Eventually, I unloaded it, put it away, undressed, and went to bed. Unfortunately, I think many betrayed spouses have thoughts like this at some point. I told her that was the one thing I hadn't shared during our recovery. For the first time, I allowed her to hug and kiss me on the forehead, not as a farewell, but in a different way. It was the first emotional connection I permitted. I confessed that I forgave her that night, even though I didn't truly mean it then. It was months later before I genuinely forgave her, but expressing those words started to open a door for me. Following that, physical touch gradually increased. Holding hands, quick kisses, hugs. These became more common in our interactions. Sex wasn't happening yet, but we were moving in that direction. Finally, almost a year after she moved back in, we became intimate. I think of this as our time of hysterical bonding. She continued journaling, and according to her, we had sex 32 times in 28 days. Years later, in a conversation, she shared that until that night, she woke up every morning thinking it might be our last day together. She kept telling herself to just hold on for one more day. She knew me well enough to understand that sex meant I was reconnecting emotionally. Today, our marriage is strong. We've both succeeded in our careers and raised 3 grown children. To our knowledge, they're unaware of any of this. We don't plan to tell them, but we won't lie if they ask. We've undergone significant changes. My wife is much stronger and wiser now. She views this as an unnecessary evil she caused, but one she triumphed over. Sometimes I think she still holds herself accountable. For my part, this topic doesn't surface in our discussions or arguments anymore. It hasn't in over 20 years. She's perceptive and often senses when I'm triggered, which still happens occasionally, maybe once or twice a year. These moments are swift but stinging. Her response is comforting. She'll hold my hand, hug me, and say, "I love you," or "Thank you." I've lost some of my inner goodness. I tend to keep my feelings to myself and handle them on my own. While I support her emotionally, I've made it clear I won't be her emotional crutch anymore. It's her responsibility to communicate the issue and propose a solution, which I'll help execute. I love her. Learning to love her again was a process. It's different now, more realistic yet still intense. Like I mentioned earlier, I believe I had to relinquish a part of my goodness for her to become a better person. At this stage of my life, I'm content with that. I hope sharing this can help someone. Every situation is unique, but this approach worked for us, and I'm grateful for it. I'm not advocating for reconciliation, I'm advocating for self-care. Focus on what you can control, not what you can't. Prioritize what benefits you in your circumstance. It's okay to be a bit selfish. Then consider working towards becoming a united we in your relationship or marriage down the line. Look up the Serenity Prayer. Its words are profoundly true, in my opinion. And remember, this forum showcases the darkest days of our lives and marriages. Despite this tragedy, we've created numerous joyful memories that far outweigh it. I wish you all the best on this journey. You can come out victorious on the other side of pain if you invest effort in yourself. Update. It's pretty unbelievable how long ago I posted this. I took a break from this account because I got a lot of negative comments privately from people strongly against reconciliation. I understand where they're coming from. Many who reached out for advice after my post were quickly told that I don't really recommend reconciliation. It's tough. It's challenging. It's painful. But if you can make it work under the right circumstances, it has its own rewards. I just wanted to update everyone that we're still married. We've now become grandparents. And if you've experienced that, you know it's a different kind of love altogether. My wife is partially retired now and does PRN work, meaning she works when needed and when she wants to. I'm still working full-time, but we managed to find plenty of time for traveling. I can't recall the last time I had a trigger, maybe around 3 years ago. It happened because our oldest child found out about my wife's affair through a spiteful relative who leads a rather lonely life. My wife handled the situation with grace and humility, and it seemed to impact me in a way that finally allowed me to move on completely. She apologized for the pain she caused me, and we both agreed that it was in the past, and if our child had any issues with it, we'd support him. But we also cautioned that ultimately, it was a matter between us, and fell under the category of our business. Thankfully, it doesn't seem to have negatively affected their relationship, although she was quite embarrassed about it. That's about all there is to share. To all of you experiencing this painful journey, we wish you the best. Update 6 years later. Got some sad news to share about me and my family. Just 3 weeks ago, my former wayward wife, passed away. She fought colon cancer for half a year and eventually left us with all of us there, right by her side in the home we built 4 years ago, the place we had planned to enjoy our retirement in. It's tough to explain the loss. It's like nothing I've ever felt before, even comparing it to the pain we all felt as betrayed loved ones in this community. In the years after our reconciliation, she spent her time making amends for the hurt she caused, and she succeeded in a big way. I really miss her, and our kids do too. But the thing is, I'm still here for a reason. In her final days, she wrote a letter to me. She asked our pastor to give it to me after the funeral when he thought it was right. I read it 3 days back. And there's a part from that letter that I want to share with all of you who have read our story and found something good in it. It shows how important it is for both the betrayed to forgive and for those who messed up to face the consequences of their betrayal even when they're truly sorry. Right now I'm in a lot of physical pain, as you know, but my faith helps me see what's ahead, and the pain gets a bit lighter. Pain can make you turn inward. And these past weeks, I've been doing a lot of soul searching. Sometimes I feel like I deserve the pain because of what I did to you, what I did to us, so many years ago. But then you lift me up and help me sit in my chair, you feed me, you bathe me, you hold my hand. You play your guitar while I lose myself in memories. It's clear to me now that this pain is a gift. It's letting me experience the purest form of love, your real forgiveness for what I did. Because only true love and forgiveness show in your actions as you care for me. I love you so much. My wife and I are both 49 years old, and we reside in South America. Recently, I've been searching online for a platform to express my frustration, particularly among people who have gone through similar experiences to mine. The reason for this is that I've just discovered that my wife, whom I've been married to for 28 years, was having an affair with a 24-year-old. I can't help but wonder how common this situation is because, had it not been for my neighbor confiding in me, I might never have known, and her affair might have continued unnoticed. We have a 19-year-old son and a 21-year-old daughter, both of whom are in college and living away from home. Our residence is situated in an affluent area. While I wouldn't describe myself as wealthy, I do come from a background of financial comfort. I hold down a modest job, and the same goes for my wife. She works as a manager at a textile company, overseeing a team, most of whom are in their 20s. Everything changed dramatically for me 2 weeks ago. It was a Friday, and I had just pulled into my driveway after work when my next-door neighbor approached me. He invited me to his house to watch a soccer game the following day, explaining that he had something important to discuss with me. I found this quite unusual since we weren't particularly close friends. We had hung out a couple of times during neighborhood events. exchanged greetings, and engaged in small talk when our paths crossed. He's around my age, but his kids are much younger than mine. He's one of those peculiar guys who jog around every morning as if they're training for a marathon. My wife and I used to tease him because he seemed to have an outfit for every occasion. One day he'd be running in matching attire, and the next day he'd be all decked out in his cyclist gear, pedaling away as if he were preparing for the Tour de France. I was a bit apprehensive because I wasn't sure what he had in mind. I assumed he might be trying to sell me something since I knew he worked in sales, or perhaps he had some investment he wanted to discuss with me. So the following day, a Saturday when I usually had little to do in the evenings except exercise when I felt motivated, I decided to take him up on his offer. He welcomed me into his home, and we settled down to watch a European Premier League game, which wasn't something I typically followed. I took a seat on his couch, and he had a beer ready for me. It was just the two of us since his wife and kids were not at home. After a few minutes into the game, he shifted the conversation and mentioned that he wanted to share something with me that might upset me, but he believed, as a man, he had a responsibility to inform me. I was thinking, here comes the sales pitch. But then he showed me a series of startling photos on his phone. These pictures featured my wife and a young man walking hand in hand at a shopping mall. He displayed 5 pictures from various angles, explaining that he had taken them 3 weeks ago while he was shopping with his own kids. Initially, he hesitated to share them with me for 3 reasons. 1, we weren't close. 2, he thought it wasn't his business. And 3, he wasn't aware of the nature of my relationship with my wife. However, as time passed, he felt compelled to share this unsettling information with me. It became increasingly difficult for him to greet me, knowing that my wife might be having an affair with another man. Initially, I experienced a whirlwind of emotions: confusion, embarrassment, and then anger towards my neighbor. I thought he might be playing a prank on me, but it quickly became apparent that he was dead serious, and the person in the pictures was unmistakably my wife. I must have stared at those images for minutes, desperately searching for some explanation to shield myself from the shame and to uphold a facade of masculinity in front of my neighbor. But my emotional mask crumbled. I couldn't restrain myself. The evidence was crystal clear. My wife was indeed having an affair with a younger man. I didn't want to accept it. I tried to convince myself there had been some terrible misunderstanding. Up to that point, I hadn't picked up on any signs that my wife might have been cheating. Although cheating doesn't seem to capture the depth of this betrayal. Yet, the evidence spoke loudly and clearly. I broke down and cried in my neighbor's house, right in front of him. It was incredibly embarrassing in hindsight. I was still at my neighbor's place when my wife returned home. I wasn't sure where she had gone that Saturday evening, but I recalled her telling me she was going out to see some friends, a lie I now knew to be false. My neighbor forwarded the incriminating pictures to my phone, and as I was preparing to leave his house, he insisted on accompanying me back to my house to ensure I didn't do anything I might regret. I initially objected, but he trailed me nonetheless. In hindsight, he likely wanted to ensure I didn't take any rash actions or confront her in a way that could escalate the situation, given my visible anger. I left my neighbor's house with him following closely, my sole focus being on the impending confrontation with my wife. She was in the kitchen when I entered through the garage door. I called her name and showed her the pictures on my phone, demanding to know who the man was that she was holding hands with. She appeared shocked, her gaze darting between me and the neighbor standing behind me, who inquired about what was happening. I insisted she answer the question forcefully. I'd never been offensive to my wife before, but I couldn't say that it didn't cross my mind at that moment. She couldn't deny the pictures. It was impossible, as the images clearly depicted her. I held the phone just inches from her face and repeatedly pressed her to identify the person she was holding hands with. My intensity must have been overwhelming because my neighbor attempted to restrain me. After some hesitation, she attempted to explain herself, stating that it was a 24-year-old subordinate who worked under her. She expressed remorse for everything, but I didn't want to hear it. I instructed her to pack a bag and leave my house. That all occurred a few days ago, and I haven't seen her since that day. However, my neighbor visits occasionally to check on me. I'm typically an introvert and value my privacy. Initially, I didn't appreciate his interference, but without him, I would have been completely unaware, and my unfaithful wife might have continued her affair to this day. For that, I can't express how grateful I am to him. I prefer not to have many friends, but I do have a therapist with whom I share my personal matters. Our children are still in the dark about all of this. I haven't yet been to see my therapist. These days, I only leave the house to go to work. It's been 2 weeks since I've had a proper meal or a restful night's sleep. I spend most of my day drowning my sorrows in alcohol and shedding tears. What should I do? Should I seek a divorce? Should I attempt to salvage my marriage? Should I reach out to my wife? The pain is still unbearable, worse than anything I've ever experienced. But it's somewhat comforting to know there are people here who've gone through similar situations. I understand that I shouldn't be drinking, but sometimes it seems like the only way to numb the pain. My wife texts and calls me almost every day at the same time, but I haven't mustered the courage to answer or read what she has to say. I'm uncertain if I'm ready to hear her side of the story. Currently, she's staying at her parents' house. Our children reside in another state. I haven't heard from them since before I learned about the affair, and it seems my wife hasn't contacted them either. I've reached out to my family and informed them of what transpired. My neighbor invited me for a run this morning, which helped alleviate some stress. I now consider him a friend. There's a strong sense of familiarity between us, almost as if I've known him for years. I'm also scheduled to see my therapist tomorrow. I've been jogging with my neighbor as much as possible. During our runs, he avoids discussing my wife, which is really helping me divert my thoughts. However, it's challenging not to think about it, mostly because I'm torn inside. Part of me wants to attempt reconciliation, but I'm unsure if my wife is even the same person I married anymore. It still feels incredibly surreal. I never imagined I'd need to consult an attorney or worry about STDs from my wife. I wanted to provide a little update on where I stand this morning. I shared what happened with my family the morning after I discovered it. My parents are heartbroken. I've gone through the messages my wife has sent since D-Day. They all express her love for me, apologies for her actions, and pleas for me to take her back. I'm still unsure about it all. If she truly means those words, why did she betray me like she did? My children are still unaware, but they'll be home in a few days as they finish college for the semester. I'm uncertain about how to break the news to them. Today, I have a therapy appointment, and I'm planning to schedule a doctor's visit and consult a divorce lawyer. I'm not certain if divorce is what I want, but I suppose it doesn't hurt to have it considered for the future. I returned from my therapist's appointment. Things remain confusing, but he and this community have guided me in the direction I should take now. While my therapist lacks experience with cheating trauma, he has referred me to someone who does. I'll schedule an appointment with them. He's given me some advice on the next steps, encouraging me to give up drinking, start exercising, and take my time before confronting my wayward wife in person. It's important to ensure I'm emotionally prepared to be in the same environment as she is. Now, addressing some questions I've received. My wife's affair partner is not married. He began working with her last year. He's 24, just a bit older than our daughter. My neighbor caught them holding hands at the mall one day and took some pictures. This morning, I sent her a text outlining my expectations. While I'm still unsure about the course of action I want to take, I made it clear that certain conditions must be met for reconciliation to even be considered. I mentioned that both of us should get tested for STDs. She needs to end her relationship with her affair partner and cease all contact, and she must disclose all the details of their actions together. As of now, I haven't received a response from her. Currently, I'm contemplating whether to confront my wife in person. She's been staying at her parents' house. My wife has responded to my text with all those demands, agreeing to the written timeline, granting access to her devices and social media, ending contact with her affair partner, undergoing an STD screening, and quitting her job. I still intend to consult with a few attorneys just in case. Her parents are already aware of the situation. They found out on the same day I did. She's residing at their place. What I'm uncertain about is whether to verify her written timeline with a polygraph test. I've heard that these tests are often unreliable, and I'm not even sure where to find one in my area. Yesterday marked the first time I saw my wife in person since D-Day. After returning from work, my brother and I visited her parents' house, where she's still staying. It wasn't easy being around her, but following this community's advice, I realized that certain things needed to be discussed and established in person, rather than through text and phone calls. Upon seeing me, her immediate reaction was to burst into tears and attempt to hug me. I promptly halted that and conveyed that physical contact with her is the last thing I desire right now. She appeared hurt by my response. She repeatedly expressed remorse for her mistake, professed her love for me, and insisted that her involvement with her affair partner was just an act. I confronted her about her excuses and made it clear that I didn't want to hear them. I informed her that I'll be consulting a divorce attorney next week to explore my options. I reiterated the steps she needs to take if I am to consider reconciliation with her. I had her send a no-contact message to her affair partner right in front of me and disclose all her social media passwords. She also handed her phone over to me, allowing me to take screenshots of all the texts she exchanged with her affair partner and to check for deleted messages. Being around her was incredibly difficult. Every time she spoke, I felt an urge to yell at her. Now, regarding my own healing process, I've given up drinking and started exercising. My neighbor and I go running in the morning. I've been reading as much as I can get my hands on. While food is still unappealing, I've started eating more than I did last week. She has already resigned from her job, showing me her resignation letter. I even called her workplace to verify her claim. However, she'll still need to work there for another month. Update. My wayward wife came by and handed me her written timeline of events from the day she met her affair partner. I haven't had the time to thoroughly read it. I've just skimmed through it briefly. Honestly, I need to muster the courage to read what she has written. Just reading the first few pages filled my mind with disturbing images of them together. I found a place nearby where we can arrange the polygraph test. I plan to set a date for both of us to go and confront her with the timeline. If she passes the test, I'm considering allowing her to return to the house, but not to sleep in the same room as me. I'd still like to give it a few months to assess what I want to do and observe her actions that might influence my thoughts on reconciliation. I've gone through her phone messages and social media, which was also quite challenging and made me feel physically sick. I noticed that she sent a no-contact message to her affair partner on D-Day in addition to the one I had her send yesterday, so yesterday's message was a reinforcement. I also used a few programs to check for deleted messages, but I didn't find any. However, since I'm not tech-savvy, I plan to ask her during the polygraph test if she deleted any. My wayward wife and I got tested for STDs, and the results came back negative. Right now, I feel like an emotional roller coaster, bouncing from one emotion to the next. One minute I'm a sobbing mess, the next I'm shaking with anger, and then I'm trying to go about my day as if nothing happened. If I don't have anything to occupy my mind, it gets flooded with disturbing images of them being together. An empty mind is the devil's workshop. A month ago, I would have confidently stated that my wife could never deceive me. However, in light of recent events, I've come to realize that cheaters do indeed lie. I used to unquestionably trust everything she said, but now I'm not as certain. I've been going through the timeline, and it's been emotionally challenging. I asked her to be completely open about everything. Her emotions, their flirting, the first kiss, and the details of their encounters. She didn't hold back, and I've had to take frequent breaks. I've only reached the halfway point, and there's still so much to go through. My wife has explained to her affair partner why she's quitting, and it turns out he's lost his job. Today marks 3 weeks since D-Day. I've consulted with a few divorce attorneys to understand my options in case I decide on a divorce. In my country, if infidelity is the grounds for divorce, the cheating spouse forfeits the right to alimony, so that shouldn't be a significant concern. The way a couple's assets are divided depends on their marriage contract. My wife and I have a full separation of goods agreement, meaning everything we own is either mine or hers. If we do get divorced, the division of assets is straightforward. The house is registered in my name, so she wouldn't have a claim to it. There are various paths a divorce could take, and the timeline will depend on how my wayward wife responds. It could range from a week to 2 years. In addition to divorce, I have the option to sue my wayward wife and her affair partner for emotional distress. I'm still unsure about which path to choose, but at least I'm aware of my options now. Regarding everything else happening, my daughter is returning home today. She's still unaware of her mother's affair, but I've already texted her to let her know that her mother is staying at her grandparents' house. I mentioned that something has happened and that I'd like to discuss it with her in person. The past 2 days have been the most challenging since D-Day. Both my daughter and son now know about their mother's affair. My daughter, being the first to return from college, attempted to contact her mother, but apparently she wouldn't reveal anything except that she had done something terrible. When my daughter arrived, I sat down with her and recounted everything I knew. I told her about her mother's affair with a subordinate who's young enough to be her son, and how our neighbor captured them on camera holding hands. She was just as shocked as I was on the day I found out. We embraced and cried together. She asked me what I wanted to do, and I admitted I didn't have a clear plan yet. I mentioned speaking with a divorce attorney, but emphasized that I'm still trying to figure out the next steps. My son returned home yesterday, and I think he took the news even harder than his sister did. I sat down with him and explained everything just as I did with his sister. He erupted in anger, shouting and using derogatory terms to describe his mother. That hurt more than I expected. I don't want my children to lose their mother, despite what she's done. I told him he had every right to be angry with her, but that I didn't want him to refer to her in such a disrespectful way ever again. As of today, both of them are staying home with me and helping out around the house. My wife has attempted to reach them, but they've been ignoring her calls, and she hasn't pushed the matter further. Update. I deeply want my family to be whole again. The past month has unquestionably been the worst of my life, but I've discovered incredible support here. Every morning before work, I've been going out to jog in my neighborhood. I've also started eating full meals again and seeing my new therapist. Although I miss my old therapist and the connection we had, the new therapist has been tremendously helpful in navigating my emotions. My daughter went to visit her mother. Despite her anger, she has expressed her desire to maintain contact with her. My son appears to have been the most deeply affected. He's very upset that I haven't filed for divorce yet, and has harshly criticized his mother. He's even made some hurtful comments like wishing she would pass. I've told him not to use derogatory language even though she's done a terrible thing. She's still his mom. It's challenging to accept that this new behavior is a result of the shock from the discovery and not something that was already there. I never imagined my son would become this kind of person. My son is legally an adult now, and I can't force him to do anything. However, I plan to encourage him to seek individual counseling alongside me and his sister. I'll also assert myself when I believe he's being disrespectful to me or his mother. Tomorrow, I'll visit her and have her read the timeline she's written in front of me. I also have a polygraph test scheduled for next Saturday. I'm still considering my options, and I believe these next 2 steps can help me make a decision. In her timeline, she describes how he gave her attention, and she found it exciting. I haven't had a proper discussion with my wife to understand exactly what was going through her mind beyond what she's written down. But if I take her at her word, her affair partner made her feel youthful, and having a forbidden affair aroused her. Seeing her wasn't the most challenging part. I've seen her a few times since D-Day. What was tough was sitting through her reading the timeline. There were moments when I cried, and others when I was filled with anger. I had to ask her to stop a few times because it was getting too overwhelming, and I needed a few minutes to process. She cried throughout the whole process, but I'm uncertain about the sincerity of those tears. She didn't object or try to skip anything. She read through the entire thing. Whenever I asked for more details, she provided them. It took us about 4 hours to get through it. By the end, I was emotionally drained, and it seemed like she was too. I told her that we would revisit these questions during the polygraph test. Again, she didn't object. It appears that she's being genuine, but I'm uncertain about whether to believe her or not. I'm still attending therapy and going running every morning. Sometimes it's challenging to keep disturbing images and dark thoughts at bay, but I'm in a much better place now than I was in the days following D-Day. I'm still undecided about what to do going forward. My wife has started seeing a therapist, and we have the polygraph test tomorrow, so maybe I'll be able to make my decision then. I've prepared a few questions that I want to ask her tomorrow, such as, have you been completely honest with me since I found out about your affair? Is the timeline you've written a comprehensive and truthful account of events? Have you had any other affairs during our marriage? Did you delete any emails or messages on your phone and social media between you and your AP that I haven't seen? Update. I brought my wife back from her parents' house on Saturday. We didn't chat much during the drive, but her body language suggested she was uncomfortable. When we arrived and waited for the examiner, she asked if I was certain about going through with this. I confirmed. She was connected to the machine for about 20 minutes and responded with no to all my questions. Afterward, I drove her back home and left her at her parents' place once more. We didn't converse much on the way back either. I was too fatigued to revisit our earlier discussion about her timeline. She did inquire about my intentions, and I honestly admitted I hadn't decided yet. The results came in on Monday, Evidently, she was telling the truth. I thought this might help me make up my mind, but I'm still uncertain. I can't decide whether to give our marriage another shot or proceed with the divorce. I long for our old life, but she hurt me deeply. She is attending therapy. Our daughter visited her a couple of times, and she has seen her therapist too. I'm unsure if they specialize in infidelity. She did indeed respond yes to the first two questions. My son is struggling with his feelings towards his mom, and it's causing concern. He's angry with me for not divorcing his mom, which is unusual, especially considering how close they were before all this. I'm uncertain if infidelity has affected his personal relationships or if other cultural and environmental factors are at play. Every time I've tried to discuss his reaction, he's shut me out. He refuses to listen, talk about his feelings, or consider therapy to address his pain. Reader comment: to be honest, he views your inability to take action as a sign of weakness. Maybe he anticipates you should respond like a man who won't stand for his wife being used like a plaything by a younger guy. The reality is this young guy got to enjoy your wife without having to deal with the baggage of a long-term marriage. Based on what I know about affairs, he likely had his way with her. Your son wants to witness his dad taking clear-cut action. It's as simple as that. OP reply: I'd argue that having my wife leave our home and consulting a divorce attorney was a decisive move. What follows isn't up to him to decide. I will ultimately make that choice. He doesn't get to dictate what's the best path forward for my life. I'm the only one who can determine the most suitable course of action moving forward. Reader comment: but spending half an hour on a park bench with a cup of coffee just to assess any progress might help you clarify your thoughts. OP reply: I believe I can do that. Thanks for the suggestion. It's been nearly a month since my last update here, and my relationship is still struggling. She has done everything I've asked, but I can't shake the thought of her deceiving me and being close with another man. Part of me desires reconciliation, but another part recognizes that I'll never fully recover from her infidelity. I followed a reader's advice and began having weekly meetings with her, mostly in public places like parks and restaurants. Both my kids have returned to college and are no longer at home. My daughter is trying to mend her relationship with her mother, while my son wants nothing to do with her. I've been meeting with my wife every week to monitor her progress. She continues to attend therapy to understand the reasons behind her actions. She claims she doesn't know why she did it, but I'm skeptical. After all, she spent 9 months in an affair, which is a long time to be uncertain about your motives. A somewhat positive surprise is that her therapist recommended she read Not Just Friends by Shirley Glass. We discussed the book and she appears to be making progress, but time will tell. She did resign from her job, and her affair partner lost his job when she disclosed the reason for her departure. I've checked her phone and email a few times. Her affair partner is still blocked, and her recent messages to him were about maintaining no contact. Whenever we've met over the past month to discuss the situation and her actions, she's claimed to be genuinely remorseful. However, I can't help but wonder if she's only remorseful because she got caught. She mentioned attending individual counseling to understand why she allowed herself to engage in the affair. She also cut ties with former friends who were apparently enabling her behavior. A story in itself. She's offered me an open channel to vent or ask questions if I feel the need. During our conversations, there were moments when I became triggered and lashed out at her. Initially, I think she was surprised by my reactions, and she tried to backtrack on the statements that triggered me. But now, when it occurs, she simply listens and lets me express my feelings. We delved into why she had the affair and her emotions during it. She mentioned justifying it as a way to find the closeness she wasn't getting at home. Now she realizes it happened because she wasn't putting effort into our relationship. In the months leading up to her affair, she began to focus heavily on her job. The limited free time she had was mostly spent with friends, leaving little time for us to be together. She acknowledges that during that period, she became self-absorbed and wrongly perceived the decrease in closeness between us as my fault. She's apologized and accepts full responsibility for her choices. She also admitted that even if there were issues in our relationship, she should have communicated with me rather than seeking satisfaction outside of our marriage. I'm not entirely sure how to interpret all of this at the moment. I guess I just wanted to share it with others for now. Reader comment: did she explain why she was willing to remain in a marriage lacking closeness, as most spouses wouldn't accept that? Or did she discuss how she managed to feel no guilt during the affair? Has she given any insight into why the vows we made when we got married seemed unimportant to her? OP reply. According to her, it didn't happen suddenly. Rather, it built up over several frustrating months. She claims to have been aware of her affair partner's attraction to her for quite some time. He had made flirtatious comments in the past, and due to mounting frustration, she eventually started responding to them. In the beginning, she justified it as just flirting and believed it wouldn't progress further. But when it did, she felt guilty. However, she rationalized it by saying she was finding fulfillment elsewhere. And I should have noticed something was wrong when our intimacy declined without her having to spell it out. During that period, she thought I was the source of her frustration, leading to bitterness. She now acknowledges how twisted her rationalizations were, recognizing her own selfishness and reluctance to voice her concerns earlier. She has repeatedly offered her support, telling me I can talk to her whenever I need. I've sat down with her multiple times to express my feelings about discovering the affair, the 2 months we spent apart, and my thoughts about any potential future with her. On each occasion, she patiently listened and apologized at the end. I'm not entirely sure if there's much more she could do that I'd be receptive to right now. Our weekly meetings only seem to confirm that I may never fully get past it. Nonetheless, we plan to continue to see if time can heal these wounds. My main issue is struggling to trust her, and it's challenging to fall asleep knowing that my wife, who slept next to me, deceived me for 9 months. I suppose I'm holding on because I'm nostalgic for how my family used to be, and I want to ensure I've given reconciliation a fair chance. Reader comment that she prioritized her attraction to a younger man over her marriage vows. OP reply, it's interesting. Those were almost the exact words she used when explaining her thought process that led to cheating. I may not be doing a great job of conveying our conversations. I tend to be concise when discussing upsetting topics or ones with many details. Of course, I can only recount what she told me, and there's still the possibility that she might be lying. She acknowledges that her choice to cheat was entirely her own. What she described as a lack of a love connection was a situation she caused. She was spending a lot of time at work and hanging out with friends. The decrease in closeness, which she used to justify her affair, was a result of her not spending much time at home. She now recognizes it was foolish to blame me for the reduced closeness when she wasn't putting in time with me. These are her words, not mine. Reader comment. Did she genuinely say that while she was involved in the affair and rejecting your advances, she felt bitter toward you because you didn't notice the decline in closeness? OP reply. No, she didn't say that. She mentioned feeling bitter before the affair. Reader comment. I'm curious if she has ever talked to you about her perception of your emotions when you discovered her affair, or what it was like for you when she was away. Can she convey that she understands the pain she caused you? OP reply. She did attempt to start such a conversation. She began by sharing how it pained her to witness my reaction when she read the timeline, and she acknowledged that whatever suffering she endured while we were apart couldn't compare to the pain I must have felt. I ended that discussion before it could go further because I didn't want to discuss my emotions. Reader comment. She knew she could sleep with you whenever she wanted. You were initiating. Nothing was lacking. OP reply. Once again, it seems like I'm not explaining things adequately. She understands that nothing was lacking on my part. She used this as a justification for her affair at the time, but she knows that her decision to cheat was her own failing. Reader comment. She seems to be implying that her emotions, which are subjective and not easily proven, were the cause of her affair. I call nonsense. OP reply. I'm not entirely sure I grasp this statement. If not for her emotions, what other reason would there be for her to cheat? Update. It has been 3 months since the affair, and she is still residing with her parents. I continue to run with my neighbor in the mornings and maintain a healthy diet. Mentally and physically, I feel better than I did before D-Day. I've been delving into self-improvement books and other materials to help me make a final decision about my marriage. She recently secured a new job at a company not far from the house we used to share, which suggests she may be anticipating moving back in soon. Our weekly meetings have been going well for her, but not for me. We've been meeting at various locations like parks and restaurants. She's followed all my requests, though at times I worry I'm giving her false hope. I'm genuinely attempting to rebuild trust, but it's proven more challenging than I expected. Forgiving her has been a struggle, and I thought it would improve with time. Yesterday marked our final meeting, a decision I hadn't shared with her until that moment. Prior to the meeting, I realized I couldn't continue like this. I needed to free myself from the constant reminder that she might cheat again if I let her back in. She broke my trust and confidence, and no matter how many meetings we had, I couldn't overcome that feeling. It seemed like our relationship had reached its end. We chose a secluded park for our meeting because I knew she might cry, beg, and potentially cause a scene, and I wanted to avoid drawing attention. Emotionally, I'm drained and can't continue these meetings. After breaking the news, as expected, she started crying and pleading. I explained how difficult this decision had been, and despite her efforts to regain my trust, I would alternate between feeling fine on my own and then furious at her for deceiving me for 9 months. I emphasized that, for both our sakes, we needed to go separate ways. I would maintain a friendly relationship because she's the mother of my children, but I couldn't trust her or share my bed with her again. I suggested we focus on rebuilding her relationship with my son, but I wouldn't force him. Despite her actions, her infidelity is an issue between her and me. My wife continued to cry, expressing her determination to win me back, but she respected my decision. I reached out to my lawyer today to finalize the divorce petition so I can serve it to her.